The promise. As the afternoon sun bathed the kindergarten classroom in a soft golden hue, the laughter of children filled the air, weaving a tapestry of innocence and joy. The little hands of Ethan and Naomi continued their work, each engrossed in their respective drawings. Ethan, his brow furrowed in concentration, was carefully adding the final touches to his dad's police uniform, dark blue and meticulously shaded to resemble the one his father wore on duty. Naomi, beside him, hummed a melody as she added bright yellow to the dress she had drawn for her mother. Her yellow was so vibrant it seemed to catch the light, much like her spirit. The two children shared a quiet camaraderie. They often sat together at the small round table by the window, where sunlight poured in through the paper butterflies that decorated the walls. It was a corner of the room that seemed to belong to them, where time could slow down and they could simply be. Their hands moved in unison, each offering a crayon or a kind word without needing to speak it aloud. The moment Ethan's crayon snapped was a simple one, the kind of incident that could easily be forgotten. He looked down at the broken piece, disappointment settling over his young face. His lower lip quivered, and his eyes welled with frustration. A small crayon may have seemed like a minor inconvenience, but to Ethan, in that moment, it was the world. His creativity, his progress on the picture, seemed to come to an abrupt halt. He didn't know what to do next. Naomi, however, was always quick to act. Without a second thought, she pushed her own crayon over to Ethan. "Here, you can use mine," she said softly, a gentle smile playing at her lips. "We can share." Ethan's face lit up, the warmth of Naomi's kindness washing away his frustration. Her smile was enough to make him feel like everything would be okay. "Thanks, Naomi," he said, his voice full of relief. He took the crayon from her, with a sense of gratitude that seemed beyond his years. It wasn't just a crayon. It was a gift, a gesture of friendship, of trust. In that simple exchange, the bond between the two children deepened. They had shared crayons before, of course, but something about this moment felt different. It was as though the crayon was a symbol of something more, a promise unspoken but deeply understood. They would always share, no matter what. They would always be there for each other. The idea of distance, of life taking them in different directions, seemed impossible in that moment. "I promise," Ethan said suddenly, his voice clear and sure, breaking the quiet lull. "I'll marry you one day." Naomi looked up at him, blinking in surprise, as if the words hadn't quite sunk in. A moment passed, and then her face softened into a smile. "Okay," she said, her tone light and teasing, though her eyes were full of warmth. "I'll wait for you." And just like that, the promise was made. It was the sort of promise that children often make in the purest form of their imagination. At that age, promises were untainted by the cynicism of adulthood. They were simple, yet powerful in their sincerity. And to Naomi and Ethan, that promise meant everything. It was more than a childhood fantasy. It was a belief in the future, in the bond they shared, in the belief that nothing could ever come between them. Their teacher, Miss Thompson, had noticed the moment as well. She saw how the two children interacted, how they gravitated toward one another without ever needing to explain themselves. Their friendship was a rare one, the kind that was meant to last, the kind that wasn't marred by petty arguments or misunderstandings. To Miss Thompson, it was a beautiful thing to witness, the beginning of something that perhaps was meant to last a lifetime. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Ethan and Naomi continued to color, their hands occasionally brushing against each other as they worked in sync. The classroom buzzed with the energy of young children, but to Ethan and Naomi, it felt as though time stood still. The world around them faded, and the only thing that mattered was the promise they had made. A promise that, to them, felt as real and binding as anything in their young hearts could comprehend. As the bell rang and the children began to gather their belongings, Naomi and Ethan packed up their things, still side by side. Naomi tucked her crayons carefully into her box, and Ethan picked up his drawing of his father. They exchanged a look, one that was full of understanding, of something unspoken but deeply felt. The promise was made, and it was etched into the fabric of their friendship. When the school day ended, Naomi's mother came to pick her up, and Ethan's father was waiting for him at the door. They waved goodbye, the simple parting of best friends who knew that the bond between them was unbreakable, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. As Ethan climbed into the car with his father, he felt a strange sense of peace. The world outside seemed as vast and unknown as it always had, but in his heart, he knew one thing with certainty. Naomi was his best friend, and he had made a promise to her, a promise he fully intended to keep. In the years that followed, the two children grew up. Their lives diverged, as they often do when childhood friendships are tested by time. Ethan's family moved away, and despite the letters they exchanged for a while, life slowly pulled them in different directions. Naomi remained in the same town, focused on her studies, determined to build a future that would take her beyond the limitations of her circumstances. But no matter how far apart they were, the promise lingered in the background of their hearts. Ethan went on to follow his father's footsteps into law enforcement, carving out a life in a world that was unpredictable and often dangerous. Naomi, on the other hand, pursued a career in medicine, driven by a passion to help others and make a difference in the world. They lived separate lives, with only distant memories of the innocent promise they had made. But in the quiet moments, when the weight of their respective lives felt too heavy to bear, both of them would remember that day in kindergarten. They would remember the sound of Naomi's soft voice offering him the crayon, the warmth of her smile, and the promise that had been sealed in the simplest of ways. In the deepest corners of their hearts, they both knew that no matter how different their lives had become, the promise had never truly faded. You said, the reunion. The night before their reunion, Ethan tossed and turned in bed, unable to silence the excitement and nerves that stirred within him. He hadn't seen Naomi in years, not since they were children, playing together without a care in the world. Life had swept them away on separate paths, and for so long, their worlds had remained apart. And yet, despite the distance that had grown between them, the memory of that promise made all those years ago still lingered in his mind, like an ember waiting to rekindle into something more. Ethan had always believed in the power of fate, the way the universe brought people together at the precise moment they needed each other. But could that truly be the case now? Was the promise of childhood something that could survive the years of separation, the heart itches, and the changes they had each undergone? The uncertainty gnawed at him as he lay there, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, the nerves hadn't faded, but they had shifted into a kind of anticipation. Ethan dressed quickly, choosing the simple button-up shirt and dark jeans, not wanting to overthink the moment. He didn't want to appear as though he was trying too hard, but he certainly didn't want to look like he hadn't cared at all. He wanted to make a good impression, a fresh start, he thought. He didn't want the years that had passed between them to weigh too heavily on their meeting. The cafe they had chosen was a quiet little place tucked away on a street lined with old trees. It was the sort of place that felt like a secret, hidden from the world, where people went to share intimate moments or escape from the chaos of life. Ethan had always liked it when he was younger, and when Naomi suggested it, he couldn't help but feel that it was the perfect spot for a reunion. When he arrived, the cafe was nearly empty, save for a few people scattered at tables, lost in their own conversations. The air was filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and soft music played in the background. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, wondering if Naomi had already arrived. His heart raced at the thought of seeing her again. What if she had changed too much? What if they were no longer the same people they had once been? And then he saw her. She was standing near the counter, her back to him, as if she hadn't noticed him yet. She was wearing a simple white blouse and jeans, her dark hair cascading in soft waves down her shoulders. The sight of her took his breath away. She hadn't changed in the way he expected. She was older, of course, but there was a familiarity about her that made his heart ache in the best possible way. Her posture was confident, but there was still that spark of warmth in the way she carried herself. She was still Naomi, the same girl he had promised to marry all those years ago. Naomi, for her part, hadn't expected to feel so nervous. When she'd first reached out to Ethan, she had been filled with excitement and anticipation, certain that meeting again would be a simple and carefree experience. But now, standing in the cafe and waiting for him to arrive, she found herself filled with doubts. She wasn't the same person she had been as a child, and neither was Ethan. Life had shaped them in ways that could never be undone, and she couldn't help but wonder if the connection they once shared would still exist. And then, just as she was about to glance around the room for a sign of him, she felt it, a familiar presence. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps or the rustling of clothes. It was the feeling of someone who had been a part of her life in a way no one else had. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She could sense it in her bones. When she finally did turn, there he was, standing in the doorway, his blue eyes locked onto hers with the same intensity she remembered. Time had added its layers to both of them, but in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. The way he looked at her, as if she was the most important thing in the room, made her heart skip a beat. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan," she repeated, this time with more conviction, as if the name itself was a bridge to all the years they had been apart. Without waiting for another word, Ethan took a step forward, his arms opening instinctively. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before stepping into his embrace. The familiar warmth of his arms around her felt like a dream, as if no time had passed, as if they had never been apart. The years that separated them melted away, leaving only the simple truth: they had found each other again. When they pulled back from the hug, they stood there for a few moments, each taking the other in. It was like seeing an old, beloved photograph come to life. Ethan was a bit taller, his jawline more defined, but his eyes, those eyes that had always been so full of curiosity, still sparkled with the same light. Naomi, too, had changed. Her face held a touch of maturity, a wisdom that came with the years, but there was still that same kindness in her gaze, that same gentle spirit that made her unforgettable. "Wow, it's really you," Naomi said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan smiled, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. "It's me," he replied, his voice thick with nostalgia. "I can't believe it's been so long." They found a quiet table by the window, and as they sat down, the conversation flowed easily at first. It was the kind of conversation that felt natural, like they had never been apart, each sharing snippets of their lives over the years. Naomi talked about her work as a pediatric nurse, about the challenges and rewards of helping children, and the way her life had shifted after her mother's passing. Ethan shared his experiences in the police force, his rise through the ranks, and the toll the job had taken on him. But beneath the surface, there was something unspoken between them. The promise, that simple, childhood vow, lingered in the air like an invisible thread, pulling them together in ways they couldn't explain. Both of them felt it, even if neither knew exactly what to do with it. As they spoke, they both noticed the subtle changes in each other, the way their faces had matured, the quiet sadness that seemed to weigh on them both. There was a certain distance between them now, an unspoken understanding that life had not been kind to either of them in the ways they had hoped. They had both faced their own battles, fought their own demons. But despite it all, the connection they once shared had not been lost. Naomi laughed lightly, breaking the silence. "I can't believe you still remember that promise." Ethan's eyes softened, and he met her gaze. "I never forgot it," he admitted quietly. "It's always been there, in the back of my mind, like a little piece of hope I didn't want to let go of." Naomi's heart fluttered. She hadn't realized how much she had missed him, how much that simple promise still meant to her. They had both moved on with their lives, but the past was never as distant as they had thought. The conversation drifted into comfortable silences as they both reflected on the years that had passed. And in those silences, the weight of the promise seemed to hang in the air. A promise made by two innocent children, now facing the complexities of adulthood. Could they hold on to it? Could they make it real, in a world that had changed them both? As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting golden rays across the table, they both knew that this was only the beginning. What came next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: life had brought them back together, and neither of them was willing to let go of the bond they shared. Not now, not ever. The rift. The days following their reunion felt like a whirlwind for Ethan and Naomi. They met frequently, exchanging stories about their childhood, their lives since they had parted, and everything that had led them to this point. Yet, despite the joy of reconnecting, there was an undercurrent of tension neither of them could quite ignore. The promise, that simple childhood vow, hovered between them like an unsaid truth, impossible to escape, yet daunting in its implications. As the weeks passed, their bond continued to deepen, but it was clear that time had altered them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. Naomi, with her quiet strength and the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, had grown into a woman who fiercely protected her heart. Ethan, having lived through the brutal reality of law enforcement, had built walls around his emotions, walls that even he didn't quite understand. The promise they had made as children was beautiful, but the world they now inhabited seemed so much more complicated than the simple dream of a future together. It was on one of their weekend outings that the first real crack in their connection appeared. The day had started with laughter and lighthearted conversation, walking along the riverbank near Naomi's apartment. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves danced to the ground in shades of red and gold, the world around them a painting of warmth and color. Ethan had reached out and gently brushed a fallen leaf off Naomi's hair, smiling as he did. "You look like you belong in one of those old-time romance movies," he teased. Naomi grinned, but there was something in her eyes, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. She loved spending time with him, but something inside her was holding back. "I'm just not sure we can go back to what we were," she said quietly, her gaze drifting to the rippling water below. Ethan's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean? I thought we were just enjoying this, Naomi." I know," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's just, things have changed. We've both changed. You have a life, Ethan, and I do too. The promise we made back then, I don't know if it fits into who we are now." The words stung more than Ethan had expected. He hadn't realized that Naomi had been struggling with the same thoughts he had kept locked away in the back of his mind. "So you think because things are different, that promise doesn't mean anything anymore?" His voice, though calm, carried a sharp edge, a defensive note he hadn't intended. It was as though she had shaken the foundation of something he had held onto for so long. "No," Naomi quickly responded, her eyes widening in shock at the sudden shift in Ethan's tone. "It's not that. It's just..." She paused, searching for the right words. "We were kids. We were so innocent back then, Ethan. Things were simple. But now, life is messy. It's not like the fairy tales we imagined. I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting within him. He had believed that reuniting with Naomi would be like finding his way back home, to something pure and true. But now it felt as though they were stuck at a crossroads, each of them afraid to take the next step. "You're saying the promise doesn't count anymore?" His voice grew quieter, hurt seeping through his words. Naomi took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had known this conversation was coming, but the reality of it hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't rejecting him, not at all. She simply wasn't sure if they could go back to that innocent promise. "I'm not saying it doesn't count," she said slowly, her eyes meeting his. "But we can't just ignore everything we've been through since then. Life has shaped us, and I'm not sure we can just erase all of that and pretend nothing changed." The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the air itself was thick with unspoken words. Ethan wanted to argue, to insist that they could make it work. That love, That promise was enough to bridge the distance between their two very different worlds. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Naomi was right. They had changed. They weren't the same children who had sat together at that little table in kindergarten, promising each other a future. The world had taken them down separate paths, and those paths had shaped them into people with experiences, desires, and fears that could no longer be ignored. It was Naomi who broke the silence this time. Maybe we just need to take a step back, Ethan. We can't force something that doesn't feel right. But we also shouldn't pretend like everything is the same. Let's figure out who we are now, before we try to figure out what we can be. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He didn't want to take a step back. He didn't want to admit that the easy, carefree days of childhood might have been more of a dream than a reality. But Naomi was right. They couldn't ignore the realities of their adult lives. They couldn't pretend that their past, however beautiful, could simply dictate their future. "Okay," he said finally, his voice a quiet surrender. "I'll respect that." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them palpable, before Naomi reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. "We'll figure this out, Ethan. Just don't give up on us, okay?" Her touch, warm and reassuring, seemed to thaw the coldness that had crept into his heart. "I won't," he promised, even though a part of him wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on to the promise of their childhood. He wasn't sure if he could ever really let go of Naomi, but the more they talked, the more he began to realize that the person he had promised to marry in kindergarten was no longer the same person standing before him. And maybe that was a good thing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet sort of understanding. They continued walking along the riverbank, not speaking much, but the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't filled with unresolved tension or confusion. It was the kind of silence that allowed them both the space to think, to breathe, and to understand that their paths were not the same. They were two adults now, navigating a world far more complex than the one they had once dreamed of. And yet, as they walked side by side, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a chapter in their story. A difficult chapter, yes, but one that would eventually lead them to something else. He didn't know what that something else would be, but he was willing to figure it out. Naomi, for her part, was more guarded, unsure of how to move forward, but still holding on to the thread of connection between them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the river in a golden glow, they reached the point where their paths had diverged earlier that day. Ethan turned to Naomi, offering a tentative smile. "I guess I'll see you later," he said quietly. Naomi nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, later." They stood there for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, before Naomi turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing by the river. He watched her go, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling within him. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was unclear. The promise had been made when they were too young to understand the complexities of life. But now, as adults, they had to decide if that promise could survive the challenges of their reality. Could their bond withstand the tests of time, heartbreak, and betrayal? Or would it fade into the past, a beautiful memory that no longer had a place in the present? Ethan didn't know the answer. But as he watched Naomi disappear into the distance, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to let go. Not just yet. The test of time. The days after their conversation on the riverbank passed in a blur of mixed emotions. Naomi found herself retreating into her work, trying to focus on the children who needed her care, while Ethan threw himself deeper into the responsibilities of his job. The distance between them had grown, not physically, but emotionally. Neither had reached out to the other, and yet, despite the space, their thoughts remained intertwined. Ethan couldn't get Naomi out of his mind. The way her eyes had softened when she told him she wasn't sure they could pick up where they left off haunted him. He had tried to ignore it, to bury it beneath the demands of his job. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the Naomi he remembered, the one who had once shared a promise with him all those years ago. He wanted to believe that promise could still mean something, but deep down, he knew he had to be patient. Time had changed them, and there was no rushing the rebuilding of something so fragile, something so pure. Meanwhile, Naomi struggled in her own way. Her heart had always been open, but now it felt guarded, as though something deep inside her had been irreparably cracked. She hadn't realized just how much seeing Ethan again would stir up old feelings. It wasn't just the nostalgia for their childhood bond that unsettled her. It was the raw, unspoken truths they had left behind. She found herself questioning what she wanted out of this reunion. Was she really ready to go back to the promise they had made? Could they really make it work? Or had life simply taken them in two directions that could never converge again? A few weeks after their walk along the riverbank, Naomi found herself standing in front of the same cafe where they had shared their first reunion. She had called Ethan earlier that day, tentative and unsure, but ultimately deciding it was time to face the distance between them. She needed clarity, needed to understand what was still there between them. They had been dancing around the issue for too long. When she stepped inside, she was greeted by the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that encouraged reflection, and Naomi couldn't help but smile faintly as she spotted Ethan already sitting at their usual table by the window. He looked lost in thought, his gaze distant, but when he saw her, his expression softened. "Naomi," he said, standing up as she approached. There was something different in his tone this time, a tenderness she hadn't noticed before. "Hey," she replied, settling into the chair across from him. The tension in the air was palpable, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something warmer, something they had both been afraid to acknowledge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with everything they had left unsaid. Naomi wasn't sure where to begin. What was there to say? She had come here to figure out whether the past could still have a place in their present. Could they try again? Could they start fresh, as adults, and leave the complications behind? "I've been thinking about our last conversation," Naomi said quietly, breaking the silence. "About what you said, about the promise." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about it too," he admitted. "And about you. About us." Naomi's heart beat faster at the way he said those words, the way he was looking at her, like they were on the edge of something important, something irreversible. "I know we've changed, Ethan," she said, her voice low. "I know life hasn't been easy, but what if we could find a way to make that promise matter? What if we could make it real, even now?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on both of them. Ethan stared at her, the old flame of hope reigniting deep within him. He had been so afraid of reaching out, afraid of pushing too hard, of wanting something that might not be possible. But Naomi was offering him something. An opening, a chance to take the risk again. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Naomi hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her napkin, as she searched for the right words. "I'm saying that maybe we've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe we're not supposed to go back to what we were, but rather move forward to something new. Something that could still be as real as the promise we made, but different. Something that fits who we are now." "Do you think that's possible?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to hold onto his composure. Naomi's words struck a chord in him. They made sense in a way that he hadn't been able to articulate himself. He had been clinging to the past, to the innocence of their childhood promise, but Naomi was asking him to see beyond that. She was asking him to let go of the fairy tale and embrace the reality of what they had become. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice full of uncertainty. "But I want to try. I don't want to let go of this, Naomi. I don't want to let go of you." Her heart swelled at his words. He wasn't rejecting her. He wasn't walking away. They were standing on the precipice of something new, something fragile yet full of possibility. But Naomi was cautious. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The past would always be there, and the promise they had made was still a part of them. but that didn't mean they had to live in its shadow. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," Naomi said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We just need to take it one step at a time. One day at a time. We can't undo everything that's happened, but maybe we can make something new out of it. Something worth fighting for." Ethan nodded slowly, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "One step at a time," he repeated. "I can do that." They sat together for a while, talking more freely now, sharing the thoughts and feelings they had kept bottled up for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of silence, moments when they both hesitated, unsure of the next step. But each word, each small connection, brought them closer to understanding one another again. They were no longer the children who had made promises on a playground. They were adults, with lives that had shaped them in ways they couldn't ignore. But somehow, in that moment, it didn't matter. They were learning to trust again, to trust each other, to trust the promise that still lingered, and to trust themselves enough to let love in once more. As the sun began to set outside the window, casting a soft golden glow on the cafe, Naomi reached across the table, her hand brushing lightly against Ethan's. The simple touch spoke volumes, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were taking the first step towards something new. "We'll figure this out," Naomi whispered, more to herself than to him. Ethan smiled, a soft, hopeful smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, we will." And in that moment, it felt as if the promise, the one made all those years ago, was beginning to shift. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future, about what they could build together. And for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at something real. Something that had stood the test of time. The struggles of the present. As the weeks rolled on, Naomi and Ethan continued to navigate the delicate balance between reconnecting and moving forward. The promise they had made so many years ago was no longer a simple, youthful vow of a future filled with innocent love. It was now a beacon of hope in their complicated, sometimes painful, reality. They both understood that life had changed them, but they still felt the pull of something familiar, something that had once felt like destiny. Yet with each passing day, they were also learning that reconnecting wasn't as easy as they had imagined. Naomi found herself struggling with her own reservations. She had thought that reopening her heart to Ethan would be a simple, clear path. After all, there had once been a time when they were everything to each other, when they had shared dreams and whispered promises. But now, everything felt much more complicated. Naomi had built a life without Ethan, a life that, though far from perfect, was her own. She had long learned to rely on herself, to trust her instincts, and to fight for the things that mattered. But now, here was Ethan, standing in front of her, asking her to take a chance again. Her work with the children was her sanctuary, the place where she found purpose and meaning. She had dedicated her life to helping others. But in her heart, there was still a part of her that longed for something more, something with Ethan. But as they spent more time together, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that he was still a part of a past she had tried so hard to move beyond. Ethan, too, was struggling. Every time he looked at Naomi, he felt the weight of the promise they had made, the promise of a love that transcended time and distance. He wanted to believe it was possible, that they could build something together, even after everything that had happened. But there was a part of him that questioned whether that bond could truly survive in the world they now inhabited. The realities of his life as a police officer, the trauma of his past, the emotional walls he had built over the years. Could he tear them down? Could he allow himself to truly love again? Naomi wasn't the same girl he had once known. She was stronger now, more guarded, and he wasn't sure how to reach her. Could he even reach her? Their interactions were filled with moments of warmth and tenderness, but also stretches of silence, of things left unsaid. They would share laughter over coffee, talk about old memories, but there was always an unspoken tension between them. It wasn't that they didn't care about each other, far from it. But they were both afraid of what would happen if they tried and failed. afraid that the past they were holding on to would only pull them back into a world where things were simpler, more certain. It was a crisp evening when the breaking point came, the moment that would force them to confront what had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Ethan had invited Naomi to dinner at his apartment, a quiet evening they had both been looking forward to. He had cooked a meal himself, something he had never been particularly good at but had taken pride in preparing for her. Naomi arrived a little late, her cheeks rosy from the chilly night air. But her smile was warm, and Ethan felt his heart lift at the sight of her. It had been a long, difficult week for both of them, and he hoped that tonight would be a fresh start, a chance to ease the distance between them. They sat down to eat, and for a while, it felt like old times. The conversation flowed easily, the familiar banter and teasing that had once come so naturally between them. But as the night wore on, there was an unmistakable shift. The conversation slowed, and the silence between them grew. Ethan felt a knot tightening in his chest. He could feel the weight of Naomi's thoughts, the unspoken words hanging between them like an invisible barrier. Finally, Naomi set her fork down, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't meet his gaze right away, but when she did, her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, uncertainty, vulnerability. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to be honest with you. I'm scared." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was scared, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. He didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He had his own fears, his own doubts, but all he had ever wanted was to make this work, to prove that they could overcome the odds. "Scared of what?" he asked quietly, his voice low and careful. Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "Scared of what's real and what's not. We've been holding on to something that might not even be there anymore. This promise we made, this idea of us. Maybe it's not enough. Maybe we're not enough for each other anymore." Ethan felt the sting of her words, but he didn't react. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the window, his hands pressed against the cool glass. He stared out at the city below, the lights flickering like distant stars. He wasn't sure how to answer her. He wasn't sure if there even was an answer. But he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to give up. Naomi continued, her voice soft, but filled with emotion. "I don't want to hurt you, Ethan. I really don't. But I can't help feeling like we're holding on to something that's already slipping through our fingers. What if we're just clinging to the past because it feels safe? What if we're not really meant to be together anymore? What if we've both changed so much that what we had back then doesn't even matter now?" Ethan turned around, his eyes meeting hers. There was pain in his gaze, but also determination. "Naomi, I can't pretend that everything is perfect, that we can just pick up where we left off and everything will be fine. I know we've both changed, but that doesn't mean what we had isn't real. We've been through so much, and I still believe in us. I still believe in this promise. I don't want to let go of it, and I don't want to let go of you." Naomi's eyes welled up with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "I don't want to let go of you either," she whispered. "But I need to know, Ethan. I need to know if we can really do this, if we can really be what we were to each other, despite everything that's happened. Can we really make this work, or are we just pretending?" The silence between them was thick, a weight they both felt pressing down on them. Ethan walked back to the table, sitting down across from her. He reached out and gently took her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I don't know, Naomi," he admitted. "I don't have all the answers, but I know that I don't want to let go of us, not without fighting for it. We owe it to ourselves to at least try." Naomi's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe in the promise they had made, in the love that had once been so easy. But her fears lingered, the questions that had been building up inside her. Could they really make it work, Or was the gap between their two worlds too wide to bridge? "I don't know if I can be what you need," Naomi said quietly, the words heavy with the weight of everything she had been holding back. "I don't know if I can let myself believe that this is still possible." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady. "I don't need you to be anything other than who you are, Naomi. I don't have all the answers, but I know that what we've shared is worth fighting for, and I'm willing to fight for it, for us." The tears that Naomi had been holding back finally fell, but this time, they were different. They weren't just tears of fear, but of something else, of hope, of longing. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, the promise they had made wasn't as lost as she had feared. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to try too." And so, despite the uncertainties, despite the fears and doubts that lingered, they both knew that they had taken the first real step towards something new. A future that wasn't built on the past, but on the courage to face the unknown together. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know where this path would lead. But for the first time in a long time, they were both willing to find out the path forward. The days following their emotional conversation were filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Naomi and Ethan had decided to take a chance on each other, to let the past shape their future instead of confining them to it. They both understood that the road ahead would not be easy. Love rarely was. Yet there was something about the way they had been drawn together again, after so many years, that made them both believe that perhaps it was worth fighting for. Naomi returned to her work with a renewed sense of clarity. The children she cared for were always her priority, but now she couldn't help but carry the hope of what her relationship with Ethan might become. Every morning, as she prepared to face her day, she found herself thinking about him. Not in the way she had when they were children, but in the way that two adults could think about each other, with all the weight of their individual lives and experiences. She didn't know where it would lead, but she had never been one to shy away from taking risks, even when it meant being vulnerable. Ethan, too, was navigating this new chapter with the same mix of anticipation and trepidation. His job had always been his anchor, but now he found himself looking forward to the moments he could steal away with Naomi, even if it was just for a quiet cup of coffee or a walk around the park. He didn't know what they could become, but every time he saw her, a part of him believed that they were starting something real. It wasn't the fairy tale romance he had once imagined, but it was theirs, and that was enough for him. Still, they couldn't ignore the challenges that lay ahead. Their lives were complicated, full of responsibilities and burdens they had each carried for years. Ethan's work as a police officer demanded long hours and emotional tolls, while Naomi's dedication to her students left little time for herself, let alone for someone else. But they had made a promise, not to be who they were, but to be who they could be together, no matter the obstacles. One rainy afternoon, a month after their conversation, Naomi invited Ethan to meet her after work. The rain was coming down in sheets, and she knew the perfect place for them to sit and talk, an old cozy bookstore she had loved for years. It was tucked away on a quiet street, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside, and the smell of aged paper and fresh coffee filled the air. Ethan arrived just as the sun was setting, the golden light catching the edges of the clouds. He smiled when he saw Naomi waiting by the door, her umbrella hanging loosely in one hand, her other hand tucked inside her coat. She was looking down at her phone, but when she noticed him, she looked up, her face lighting up with a warmth that still made his heart race. "Hey," she said softly, stepping toward him, her wet shoes making a soft sound on the pavement. "Hey," Ethan replied, taking her umbrella from her as they walked inside together. The familiar, comforting scent of books enveloped them both, and for a moment, they stood there, simply taking it all in. "Do you still love this place?" Naomi asked, looking around with a smile as they made their way toward a small seating area near the back. "I do," Ethan said, glancing at the rows of books that lined the walls. There's something about it, isn't there? Like it holds so many stories, some of them yet to be written. Naomi chuckled softly, her gaze drifting to the shelves. You know, I used to come here all the time when I was younger, before everything got so complicated. It's one of those places where I feel like I can just breathe. Ethan nodded, pulling out a chair for her. I get that. I think we all need a place like that. They settled in, ordering 2 cups of coffee from the counter before sitting down. The shop was quiet, save for the soft hum of the lights and the occasional turning of a page. Naomi looked at Ethan, her heart full of things she hadn't said yet. The last month had been filled with small moments of connection, but today felt different. There was something about the quiet, the intimacy of the space, that made her want to say everything all at once. Ethan, she began, her voice hesitant but steady. I've been thinking a lot. About us. About what we're doing here. He looked at her, his expression open, waiting for her to continue. I don't want to rush anything, Naomi said, her fingers curling around her cup. I don't want to go into this expecting everything to be perfect. But I do want to know, can we really build something, despite everything? Is it possible for us to make it work, even though we've both changed so much? Ethan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Naomi, he said quietly, I'm not sure about a lot of things, but what I do know is that I want to try. I want to take this one step at a time, see where it leads. I want us to build something real, not because of the promise we made as kids, but because of what we are now, 2 people who found their way back to each other. And I think that's something worth holding on to. Naomi felt a sense of relief wash over her. His words were simple, yet they resonated deeply within her. She had spent so much time wondering whether their past would haunt their future, whether they were simply chasing something that could never be real again. But in that moment, she understood. They weren't trying to recapture what they had lost. They were building something new, something uniquely theirs. Okay, Naomi said softly, her voice steady now. Then let's do it. Let's take it one step at a time, and see where we end up. The relief in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. He smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Naomi's heart flutter. One step at a time, he repeated, and for the first time, she felt certain that they were on the right path. As they sat together, talking about everything and nothing, the world outside seemed to fade away. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the sound of it against the windows was soothing. It was the first time in a long while that Naomi felt at peace, not with the past, but with the future. It was as if, for the first time, she had found a way to believe in the possibility of love again. Not the perfect love she had once imagined, but a real, grounded love that could survive the twists and turns of life. And in that small bookstore, surrounded by the stories of others, they began writing their own. One page at a time, one moment at a time. The journey ahead wouldn't be without its struggles. There would be moments of doubt, times when they questioned whether they were truly on the right path. But in the quiet moments like these, with the sound of rain and the warmth of shared smiles, they both knew they had something worth fighting for. Something that, no matter what, they weren't willing to give up on. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories are the ones that take the longest to unfold. And Naomi and Ethan had all the time in the world to find their way back to each other.